Hey, it's Phoenix and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm very excited because today I'm going to present a new episode as part of my Mind and Art series. I have a very special episode planned for today, so without further ado, let's dive right in. Now I do want to warn you, this episode does have spoilers for the show Mr. Robot, so if you haven't seen the show, then I suggest that you watch it, and also suggest that you do not watch this episode of my Mind and Art series unless you are okay with spoilers. So with that out of the way, let's dive right in. Now, you might be wondering why I chose Mr. Robot as part of my Mind and Art series, and that is a very good question. I would say that just right off the bat, that Mr. Robot explores mental illness and art in a way that is very beautiful and fantastic through the medium of film specifically. And I think that it is done very well. And because of its true-to-life depictions and representations of mental illness and the struggle of people who suffer from it, I thought that Mr. Robot would be a good show to discuss and analyze as part of my Mind and Art series. Now, let's start off with Mr. Robot and the character as well, Elliot. So they're two different characters, Elliot and Mr. Robot. The show is called Mr. Robot, so the attention is on Mr. Robot himself, although Elliot is actually the main character in the show, although Mr. Robot obviously is an important character as well. But you find out in the first few episodes that Elliot is talking with Mr. Robot, who tells Elliot that he can change the world and that they want to revolutionize reality and society and culture. And so Mr. Robot and Elliot begin to do just that. But you find out later on in the show, of season 1 specifically, that Mr. Robot is actually a hallucination of Elliot's. And Mr. Robot is Elliot's father, or at least a representation of his father, but not literally his father because Elliot's father is dead. And so this is what's really interesting about this idea of Elliot as being someone who hallucinates another side of himself, Mr. Robot, because you also find out later that Elliot is Mr. Robot. So not only does Elliot talk to someone in his mind and hallucinates him, but he also is that person. Whenever people are dealing with him, they think they're dealing with Elliot, but they're really dealing with Mr. Robot, who, to make a long story short, is a different personality. And this is actually very consistent from what I've experienced and seen with DID and multiple personality disorders, dissociative identity disorder, as well as what is also called. And the reason why this is important is because I don't think that multiple personalities has been depicted in such an intelligent and compassionate way as it is in Mr. Robot. What's really fascinating about this little tidbit specifically with mental illness and the way that characters behave in this show is that Sam Esmail and Rami Malek, Sam Esmail who is the writer of the show, but also Rami Malek who is Elliot the character, and other characters as well, such as Christian Slater, who is Mr. Robot, they have experienced some of these elements that you find in the show, which is why they are able to depict it. Because basically, as you can imagine, they had something to say. And I think that specifically is very remarkable. Now, to get back to Mr. Robot as a character, and as someone who has multiple personalities, for me personally, I find that to be a very beautiful metaphor, even if it's been done before in previous shows, such as Fight Club, where you have this character who you think is real, who is really you, and is really a part of you. And I have to admit that in my understanding of my own mental illness, I've been surprised to realize that I do, to some degree, have extensions of myself. While I don't dissociate completely, there is a way in which in the past I've actually dealt with different parts of myself, whether this was Tyson, the Snake Angel, or other characters who you would actually find in my fiction, such as in my book The Street Kid. But what is remarkable is that to see a representation of a hallucination or a person who becomes a different person was actually very boundary breaking for me, because I hadn't seen such a passionate depiction of such a thing. As someone myself who suffers from schizophrenia and bipolar, am not always sure what to do with my symptoms and what people might perceive as being weird or strange or taboo. And what's really fascinating about this show is that for me personally, I could very much identify with Elliot. Elliot was someone who was multiple people, or at least had parts of himself that needed to be integrated. And I find that to be very remarkable, that they were able to depict that in such a beautiful way. It does seem sometimes that when I am suffering and struggling with my own mental illness, that there are parts of me that are in conflict. There are representations of myself that I'm not fully aware of because I don't see it projected in a television show such as Mr. Robot. And so being able to see the show and being able to see them depict these things really was remarkable. And I think that Mr. Robot is a very powerful metaphor, Mr. Robot himself, as representing another side of yourself, or representing another side of your mind and psyche, and of mental illness itself. In my mind, the reason why the show is very powerful is because Mr. Robot is an extension of Elliot. And they are one and the same, but also distinct. And I think when you're struggling with mental illness, there is this kind of fragmenting and splintering of different pieces that you aren't always able to put together. And I think that it is really remarkable the way that they capture it in this show. Now, there is another theme in this show that I think is very important, and that is the idea that things are not what they seem. This is an idea that I've explored a lot in my writing, that there may be things that I'm writing about that I may think, that people may think are very real, which they are real, but there's another side to it to where there's a much more ambiguous relationship between certain events or certain characters or certain descriptions and ideas that I find very interesting in my own writing, as well as in the writing of shows such as Mr. Robot and various artistic aesthetic pieces that deal with these kinds of themes. And so I explore the theme in my own writing and in other places, the theme that things aren't what they seem, because I think it is very important. One way in which, according to the show, things are not what they seem is Elliot himself. Elliot is narrating the show, but it's never really clear who he's talking to, and it's not always clear that what Elliot is describing is necessarily real. And so in that way, we have the unreliable narrator, because we don't immediately know what is real, what is really happening, and even Elliot himself doesn't know what is happening. And I think that's a very powerful theme. So not only do we not know if Elliot's perspective is true, I think in my own life, I'm not even sure my own perspective is true, which might sound a little bit dramatic, but it's a very important point. There is a way in which reality is so multifaceted and complicated that there are times where I'm not even sure that I can trust my own mind, or that I can trust what other people are telling me. And I think that this is captured very well in the show, because it shows what it's like through the filter of just life in general, of just an average perspective, but also through the perspective of mental illness, which casts a lot of shadows and doubt on your perspective when you have mental illness. And I think in that way, that is a very powerful theme. And that is why I really wanted to talk about Mr. Robot as a show and as part of my Mind and Art series, because I think it definitely captures these other pieces of mental illness, such as what I've been discussing. And so in my life, I'm never sure what is real. And it is so amazing to see a perspective and depiction of that idea represented on screen through drama, because I think it definitely captures an interesting perspective that I think people that might have more typical, I would describe neurotypical perspectives, don't necessarily think about. And that is very interesting, because it literally means that people perceive the world differently, and that you definitely are in kind of a hyperdrive and hypersensitivity whenever you struggle with mental illness. To give you an example in my own life, one way in which I can get derailed is by delusions, where I believe something so deeply that it isn't true. And in the case of Mr. Robot, this happens all the time in the show, because you're not sure if Mr. Robot, or you're not sure if Elliot is himself, you're not sure if he's representing another self, you're not sure if what he's seeing is true, you're not even sure if what he's saying is true. And I find that to be very remarkable. And so, because I've definitely always identified with that theme of things not being what they seem, I very much was able to identify with this idea that things aren't what they seem in my own life, and nor are they to other perspectives, even if it is shown that way in fiction. Now, the show is very special to me for a variety of reasons, but one reason is the way in which it captures the complexity of mind and the uniqueness of mind. It does seem to me as though the mind is incredibly powerful with what it can convey and with what it can represent. And I think that that is extremely powerful in terms of thinking about the idea that the mind is not necessarily so linear or typical or average in the way that we often imagine. People can have very divergent experiences. And I think that this is a very important theme to keep in mind, to remember that there are so many different perspectives to understand in the world and to understand in general. And this is one thing that I think that this show captured very well, and is something that I hope to continue to represent in my own art and in my own writing. The mind is a very complicated thing. It is interlocking, and there are different layers and different levels you could even describe that are constantly revealing themselves and are constantly in tension. And I like that idea, that the mind is not so straightforward as it seems, and neither is art and experience or aesthetic concerns. And even just the way in which we experience our emotions or our thoughts. And that really is a powerful and amazing thing to keep in mind, that the mind is multifaceted and that it doesn't always obey strict reductionist laws of what we expect the mind to be. And I find that to be very powerful. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, because I think it's an important part of the puzzle here, is the way in which Elliot understands his own mind and the way in which he understands his emotions. Elliot definitely does express his emotions very fully and authentically in the show. And I think that that is very important because it helps break the stigma of mental illness and the things that we normally expect from mental illness, the way that we expect it to be depicted as kind of stereotyped and caricatured. But what is so fascinating about this show is that Elliot and the writers of the show and Christian Slater and all of these wonderful actors who are in the show are able to show us that things are complicated with the mind and with mental illness and with understanding what is going on in our own lives and through our own perspective and unique experiences. And I do think that is a very powerful theme to capture. And so Elliot showing his emotions is an example of this. A show tackling such intense themes is another example of this. And what I want to say specifically is that the reason why the show is so special to me and why I find it to be great material for talking about the mind and art is because these things are represented in a beautiful way, or at least can be represented. And it's boundary breaking for me to think that I can see a process happening in my own mind happening in a television show is really remarkable, because it gives me a deeper perspective on what my mind really does in my life and how complicated my mind actually is in terms of its expression and manifestation. And I think that that is extremely important for me to keep in mind. And so I love the idea that the mind and the complexities in mental illness and human emotion and suffering and struggling can be depicted in such a beautiful way. And I hope to capture that in my own work, my own art, my own writing, because I think that they are very important themes. I think they capture a lot of these details that I've been discussing in this episode of my Mind and Art series. The way in which art can capture different perspectives, the way that we can break past our own boundaries and understand that things in the world are not straightforward, that they are very complicated, and that we often don't know what to do with them, but that part of the fun, or at least the adventure, is by exploring it. And it definitely keeps us, I would say, in suspense, which is a very remarkable thing, to always be engaged with these complicated facets of our own minds and of people and dynamics and relationships. And I think that it is a very powerful thing, as well as a very powerful thing. I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching this episode, and I hope that you will check out more videos on my YouTube channel. There will be much more content to come, so I hope that you'll keep a lookout. And yeah, thank you for watching. I'm Phoenix, and I will see you next time.